Okay. All right. I have the honor of presenting someone who, over the past year, I'd like to call him a colleague, if I may, David. David and I have never met in person, but similar to so many people in Armenia and Artsakh that I have ended up meeting in person for the first time on this trip. I've been working with David for, I don't know, about almost a year now. And you don't need to meet someone in person in order to share the same concerns and interests. So before David, I'm going to cut into my presentation of you for just 2 minutes, and I'd like to do one special thing. We have a very special guest here today. His name is Mels. Mels was a POW for 10 months in Azerbaijani captivity. We worked with his brother. He's from Gyumri. Our staff and I went to Gyumri last summer, worked with his brother, worked with all the parents whose children were taken as POWs, 62 of them. Over the last year, 30 have returned. There are another 32 that are still in Azerbaijan in captivity, who have been subjected to extrajudicial trials. And they've been tried in sham trials, and they've been sentenced. We don't give up the fight. We work with these families to give them support. We continue to gather the evidence because we continue to write about what is happening to them while they're in captivity. I'd like all of you to join me in welcoming Mels, because CFTJ was live on WhatsApp with his brother as his brother went to the airport to see if in fact his brother was going to be on a flight back, because Azerbaijan plays a lot of games. There have been flights that have come from Azerbaijan with the promise of Armenian men who are in captivity returning, and then the doors of the airplane will open and no one will step out. So even though we knew that Mels was going to be returning, none of us were sure. And his brother Diko, that you will meet in the next couple of days, had us live on his WhatsApp until the airplane doors opened. Mels stepped out and actually hugged his brother. So join me in celebrating the return of a hero. Also join me in supporting him and his families and keeping their voices amplified until we make sure every single one of these young men return home. Mels. Մելս ջան, շատ ապրես, շատ շնորհակալություն, որ այսօր եկար եւ մասնակցում ես։ Շատ կարեւոր է, որ դուրսի ժողովուրդը, դուրսիները ամենը լսեն քո մասին եւ քեզի նման ուրիշները, որ դեռ չեն վերադարձած եւ մենք այդ պայքարը կմղենք։ I said everybody needs to see him, know the story firsthand, and we will continue the fight for our brothers and sisters, mind you, to return home. All right, with David, I didn't want to take the thunder away from you, but I would like to now introduce you to David Phillips. David Phillips is currently director of the program on peace building and rights at Columbia University's Institute for the Study of Human Rights. The program seeks to shape policy by working closely with U.S. officials and international stakeholders at the UN and in foreign governments. The program incorporates a communications strategy to raise awareness about policy initiatives through regular policy reports, articles, and media appearances. Director David Phillips brings 30 years of experience as a scholar, foundation executive, think tank director, and as a U.S. and UN official. The program on peace building and rights at Columbia University's Institute for the Study of Human Rights offers documentation on, quote, human rights, and foreign terrorist activities in Artsakh. The project draws on primary sources documenting crimes against humanity and other atrocities committed by the Azerbaijani armed forces and Turkish-backed Islamist fighters against Armenians. The documentation project on atrocities in Artsakh bears witness to crimes against humanity. Documentation can be a deterrent to future crimes. It can also preserve evidence to hold perpetrators accountable. David frequently publishes opinion pieces on human rights conditions in Turkey and Artsakh. He also provides commentaries at Zoom conferences and podcasts. And here's my personal note about David. As I said, I've never met him in person. We met in the middle of COVID, soon after the Artsakh war happened. David doesn't do this just for Artsakh. He does this for the Kurds in northern Syria, as well as many other groups that are stateless or unrepresented. And that's where we are of kindred mind and spirits. And David recruited me. He didn't have to work to try hard. It was just one sentence. Will you do what you're doing for Artsakh and Armenia for the northern Syrians and the Kurds? Well, one, I'm Armenian. Two, it doesn't matter who the people are that need support and help to document war crimes. On top of it, I was born in Syria and I speak and understand Arabic. So that was added value. So David and I started working together, and it's been an absolute pleasure working with David. And it's David, next time you'll be here in person, because I will award you at the end of your talk. However, we'll accept you this way because as life is, it's a hybrid. And what's most important is that David is with us today. Thank you very much, David. It's 7 a.m. in New York, so that is impressive. David, take it away.
Gassia, thank you for your warm and generous introduction. I confess I was so excited about today's program that I've been up for hours, well before the sun has risen. I'm so pleased to join you today, though be it virtually. As you mentioned in your introductory remarks, the program on peace building and human rights at Columbia University bears witness to Turkey's crimes against Armenians through its Artsakh Atrocities Project. Almost immediately towards the end of active conflict, we launched the project to document crimes against humanity and other atrocities committed by Azerbaijani armed forces and Turkish-backed Islamist fighters against Armenians. Facts are often forgotten or obscured in the fog of war. I can attest to that from a variety of personal experience. We launched the project to preserve details that can be used to prosecute the perpetrators and for future generations. From September 27th to November 10th of 2020, over 44 days, Azerbaijan unleashed its armed forces, indiscriminately bombing Artsakh, committing war crimes which are documented by Colombia's Artsakh Atrocities Project. Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan was forced to sign the ceasefire agreement with essentially a gun being held to his head. Russia and Turkey dictated terms as Azerbaijan's artillery took aim at Stepanakert after bombarding Shushi. Azerbaijani armed forces did not act alone. They were backed by Turkish military and Islamist mercenaries with armed drones, heavy artillery, rocket systems, and special forces. Up to 2,000 jihadis from Syria and Libya were promised a bounty for killing Armenians, as evidenced by the Syrian Human Rights Project. The fact that Turkish special forces and their jihadi proxies were involved does not absolve Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev of responsibility. His command and control responsibility warrants special scrutiny when it comes time to prosecute the perpetrators. Nearly 4,000 Armenian fighters and civilians died as a result of Azerbaijani Turkish operations, and over 100,000 civilians were displaced. Armenian Orthodox churches were targeted, as were civilians. There are verified cases of Turkish-backed forces mutilating dead bodies, beheading and executing both combatants and civilians, and using banned weapons such as cluster bombs and white phosphorus gas. These instances need to be investigated and documented. A former UN Special Rapporteur recently wrote to me about an Armenian-American doctor from Boston who gathered evidence of skin burns and poisoning that is the result of white phosphorus by the Azerbaijani army. She took samples back to the United States for laboratory analysis, but as yet she has not been able to find a lab to investigate it further. It's absolutely imperative that she and the government of Armenia work to get documentation of the use of white phosphorus, which is a weapon of mass destruction. The results of these test results are essential to documenting Azerbaijan's use of WMD and holding perpetrators accountable. We were not bashful in our research and documentation. The Artsakh Atrocities Project named names, identifying the perpetrators and calling for accountability. These perpetrators include military personnel in Azerbaijan's armed forces, their Turkish counterparts, and jihadis acting at the behest of Aliyev and Erdogan. At a minimum, these perpetrators should be sanctioned while evidence is further organized for potential war crimes trials. I invite members of the audience and their networks to provide specific actionable intelligence on crimes that Colombia can highlight through its Artsakh Atrocities Project. The website that we use to document and provide information can be accessed by all of you. And Gassia, I hope that you'll make a link to the website of the Artsakh Atrocities Project available to the audience. I want to address the following remarks to Mel's, who received a standing ovation just moments ago. In addition, the Artsakh Atrocities Project has focused on information on prisoners, Armenian prisoners of war, and has called for their release. At a conference hosted by Colombia, we highlighted the continued detention of Armenian POWs, which violates terms of the 2020 ceasefire agreement, as well as the Geneva Conventions. Using POWs as pawns to exact political concessions in bargaining is a violation of international humanitarian law, and it's morally reprehensible. Colombia held the conference on POWs. We reached out to members of Congress and US officials and called for action addressing their plight, the plight of POWs. At this forum today, I want to specifically extend my sympathy to families and solidarity with those who have been detained, as well as other victims. The pattern of atrocities dates back to Azerbaijan's aggression in 2016. The failure of accountability then provided a green light for Aliyev to renew aggression in 2020. Washington's failure to invoke Section 907 of the Freedom Support Act, which responds to Azerbaijan's aggression against Armenians by banning any kind of direct US aid to the Azerbaijani government, was tantamount to turning a blind eye. We should learn from the failure of business as usual in 2016 and not repeat the mistake today by relying on Azerbaijan to make up the energy shortfalls resulting from energy sanctions on Russia for its war against Ukraine. Realpolitik has no place when crimes against humanity have been committed. Mercenaries played a central role in Artsakh. Colombia's research revealed a pattern as Turkey rotated jihadists from one armed conflict to another, from Syria to Iraq and Libya, and ultimately to Artsakh. For example, Turkey transported leaders of the Hamza Division, the Sultan Murad Division, the Suleiman Shah Brigade of the Syrian National Army to Artsakh. Turkey's malign activities are a direct challenge to US interests, spreading an arc of instability from Anatolia to Mesopotamia and the Eastern Mediterranean. Ahmet Davutoğlu's heralded policy of zero problems with neighbors actually involves conflict with all of Turkey's neighbors. Truth is expendable in service of Ankara's strategic interests. Turkey invaded historic Kurdish lands in northern and eastern Syria twice, in 2017 and 2019. Erdogan justified this aggression in the name of countering terrorism. In truth, Kurds in Syria never launched a single cross-border operation on Turkish territory or targeted Turkey's armed forces. Kurds in Iraq were also targeted by Turkey's military. Turkey has 40 military bases and facilities in Iraqi Kurdistan. Its most recent incursion occurred on April 17th, 2022, when it used US-made F-16 warplanes and Apache helicopters to attack. And now Turkey wants additional F-16s and upgrade kits so it can increase the efficiency of its war-making machinery. Both Kurds in Syria and Iraq joined America's call to fight ISIS, and more than 11,000 Syrian Kurds died at our behest. Failure of the US to uphold the national and security interests of the Kurds casts doubt on America's reliability as a partner. Turkey's contempt for its neighbors is nothing new. It invaded Cyprus in 1974 and still occupies 1/3 of Cypriot territory. At this moment of global energy crisis, the development and delivery of natural gas supplies from the Eastern Mediterranean are complicated by Turkey's illegal occupation in Cyprus. Turkey lays claim to Greece's territorial waters. Confrontation between Turkish and Greek forces in the air and at sea are routine. Erdogan has questioned the legitimacy of the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne, which enshrined borders of nations emerging from the Ottoman and Habsburg empires. Erdogan's remarks questioning Lausanne, which he made during a trip to Athens, caused fear that Turkey would embark on a violent campaign of territorial expansion. Such would be par for the course, as Turkey routinely transgresses the borders of its neighbors. Natural gas supplies from fields in Israeli territorial waters are also complicated by the Cyprus situation, as a natural gas pipeline would traverse Cypriot waters. Turkey and Israel have been at odds since the Mavi Marmara incident in 2010, when Turkey staged the Gaza Freedom Flotilla. Whereas spotlighting the plight of Palestinians is a noble endeavor, manufacturing a conflict with the Israeli Defense Forces is not. Now we come to today and the war in Ukraine. Ankara's approach to Ukraine is deeply worrying. Turkey refuses to impose sanctions on Russia and serves as a safe haven for pro-Putin oligarchs to shelter their super yachts and their money. Turkey seeks financial and diplomatic benefits from the conflict. Erdogan is transparent about his self-interest. He recently declared at a conference of the Justice and Development Party, "With the Ukraine crisis, our country has become a rising star in sectors such as finance and tourism. By God's will, we will fulfill our promise to make our country one of the world's 10 economies by making the best use of opportunities." Turkey may view itself as a rising star, but the star is rising over the dead bodies of tens of thousands of victims. I wrote a book that was titled An Uncertain Ally, Turkey Under Erdogan's Dictatorship. In retrospect, the title is too kind. Turkey has gone rogue. It is becoming a pariah in the international community. Turkey's application for EU membership was suspended by the European Parliament for domestic human rights abuses, including indiscriminate attacks on Kurdish communities in the southeast of Turkey under the guise of fighting terrorism. Turkey has given a life sentence to my friend and colleague Osman Kavala. His so-called crime, organizing Turkish civil society in Gezi Park, calling for environmental rights. Many scholars and journalists have also been arrested for speaking their minds. Turkey demands privileges because it is a NATO member. Truth be told, NATO is more than a security alliance. NATO is a coalition of countries with shared values. If Turkey applied to join the alliance today, its application would be thrown out because Turkey is Islamist, anti-American, corrupt, and a serial violator of human rights. Erdoganism is a form of populist authoritarianism and political ideology based on a cult of personality that surrounds Tayyip Erdogan. Corrupt at its core, it is chauvinistic, nationalistic, and discriminatory towards ethnic and religious minorities, including Armenian Christians. Erdogan and his family have amassed a huge personal fortune since the AKP came to power in 2003. Erdoganism uses elections as window dressing to consolidate his power. He abuses the rule of law and the separation of powers. Government in Turkey exists to advance the interests of leadership rather than to serve the electorate. The Global Corruption Perceptions Index for 2021 ranked Turkey 96th, down from 77th when Erdogan became prime minister in 2003. The 2021 Global Democracy Index placed Turkey 103rd, down from 88th in 2006. The most recent dispute with Turkey concerns its opportunistic threat to veto the application of Sweden and Finland to join NATO. President Biden welcomed the leaders of Sweden and Finland to Washington on May 19th. The historic membership of these countries will broaden the circle of NATO members with democratic governments and send a strong message to Vladimir Putin about Russia's autocracy and aggression against Ukraine. Message to Tayyip Erdogan: NATO is not the Grand Bazaar. Rather than behaving like a statesman, Erdogan acts more like a carpet merchant, trying to leverage NATO expansion with Turkey's narrow nationalist demands. He wants NATO members to classify the PKK, the Syrian Defense Forces, and the Fethullah organization as threats. The United States, he demands, should extradite Pennsylvania-based dissident cleric Fethullah Gulen to Turkey. He demands that all NATO members, as well as Sweden and Finland, cease any activity of the PKK, SDF, or FETÖ on their territories. He also has demanded that the US and other NATO bodies members lift all sanctions related to Turkey's purchase of the S-400 surface-to-air missile system from Russia. Turkey demands new F-16 fighter jets and upgrade kits for its existing warplanes. It wants to rejoin the F-35 program from which it was expelled after activating the Russian S-400 system. Turkey wants the US to lift its ban on Turkey's export of military products containing Western components. It should be noted that US computer chips were used in drones that attacked Artsakh and killed civilians. This extortion by Turkey is part of a pattern of abusing the international system. Erdogan's hardline opposition to NATO's expansion raises the question of whether Turkey even belongs in the alliance. Article 13 of the NATO Charter provides a mechanism for member states to withdraw. The Charter needs a procedure to suspend or expel a member state that does not abide by NATO rules or represent NATO values. The Biden administration must not give in to Erdogan's extortion, nor should NATO. If Turkey does not approve of NATO's policies, it should simply resign from the alliance and join like-minded Eurasian autocracies in Russia's collective security treaty. I do not consider Armenia a like-minded Eurasian autocracy because fundamentally the values of Armenians align with the values of Americans and other Western countries. Turkey cannot act with impunity. Turkish-backed perpetrators in Artsakh and elsewhere must be held accountable for their crimes against humanity. The Artsakh Atrocities Project preserves evidence of war crimes to deter future crimes. Universal jurisdiction is an emerging and important tool in international law. It allows perpetrators to be held accountable regardless of where the alleged crime was committed and regardless of the nationality or country of residence of the accused. Erdogan and Hakan Fidan, the head of Turkey's National Intelligence Agency, don't belong in office. They belong at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, prosecuted for war crimes in Artsakh and elsewhere. I would like to say a special word of appreciation to the organizers of today's conference, the Center for Truth and Justice, for inviting me. I would like to thank our project partners, the Ombudsman on Human Rights in Artsakh and the Armenian Assembly of America. I am thrilled to accept the Ambassador of Truth Award. I am also honored to be a co-recipient with Michael Rubin, whose outstanding research and writing and publishing has done so much to shed a light on Turkey's heinous activities and to motivate US officials to reconsider the impunity with which they treat Turkey in world affairs. Enough happy talk about Turkey as a valued member of NATO. We must see Erdogan's Turkey as it is, not how it was or how we wish it to be. I hope that this conference marks a new phase in US-Turkish relations and international relations with Turkey. I pledge to you my continued support and advocacy on behalf of the victims of Artsakh and the victims of other Turkish crimes around the world. Thank you very much. Pleased to be here, and best wishes for the good conference.
David, give me the opportunity to actually award you. I'm happy to award the Ambassador of Truth Award to David. This award celebrates those who speak out against misinformation and propaganda, stand up for what's right against all external pressures. It is an award to celebrate courage to speak up for those whose voices are silenced. Telling the truth is a rare commodity. While the world forgot or did not consider Artsakh and Armenia, and many tried to hush their voices, David spoke up through his publications, talks, and webinars. He spoke the truth based on evidence. For this, David, Center for Truth and Justice is proud to award you. I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to hold it up, and maybe they can do something about this. Can we flip it so you can see it? It's actually quite attractive. We will take it back with us to the United States and put it in the mail to you. Thank you very much, David. We appreciate the fact that you've been up and everything you do, and we have an ally in you, and for that, we're very thankful.
Well, thank you so much, Gassia. Gassia, let me just add one point here. I received a letter when I was a younger man from Elie Wiesel, in which he said, Thank you for giving voice to the victims. I took that letter as a contract, a commitment that I would devote my professional activities to helping those who had been victimized by aggression, racism, and chauvinism. And for these reasons, I've been so committed and honored to work on behalf of Armenians and other peoples who are victims of Turkey's crimes. So thank you so much for having me here today.
Thank you. If you want to stay on, David, you're more than welcome to, but I believe it's time for part 2, and we will leave you alone for a while. Thank you.
Hello, greetings everyone. David, that was, wow, what a presentation. Michael, you got a tough act to follow, but I know you'll do a great job. So I'm Tim Jemal. I am the president of a newly founded nonprofit organization called Global Arm. Our mission is to improve economic and security ties between the United States and Armenia. One of our founding principles is self-determination for the people of Artsakh, because in our view, it's the only solution that will provide peace and stability and security to the people who live there. I have the honor of introducing our second keynote speaker, Dr. Michael Rubin. Dr. Rubin is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., where he specializes in Iran, Turkey, and the broader Middle East. A former Pentagon official, we won't hold that against you. You'll turn them around at some point. Dr. Rubin has lived in post-revolution Iran, Yemen, and both pre- and post-war Iraq. He has also spent time with the Taliban before 9/11, and for more than a decade, he taught classes at sea, about the Horn of Africa and Middle East conflict, culture, terrorism, to deployed U.S. Navy and Marine units. Dr. Rubin is the author, co-author, and co-editor of several books exploring diplomacy, Iranian history, Arab culture, Kurdish studies, and Shiite politics. And for those who, during the war, when I know many of us in this room were clamoring for information and analysis, I know I turned to you. It was for people like us seeking some rationale for what was going on. Your writings were extremely valuable, and we thank you for that. He's written, as I said, extensively on Artsakh, the war, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. He has a PhD and an MA in history from Yale University, where he obtained a BS in biology. So with that introduction and that bio, I'd like to welcome to the podium Dr. Michael Rubin.
Thank you for that generous introduction. My philosophy is there's nothing that can be said in 30 minutes that can't be said in 10 minutes. And so I'm going to try to be brief so that we can end up having much more of a conversation, a back and forth, and hopefully also get David in on that question and answer session. I want to start by really thanking CFTJ. You know, I tend to be allergic to conferences. And oftentimes I have trouble staying awake in conferences. This conference is the exception, simply because there's so much valuable information. It's not always the same people saying the same thing that we've heard 100 times before, but there's a real learning experience here, at least for me, and I hope for others as well. And so I really do want to thank CFTJ, its sponsors, and the students that made this possible as a volunteer organization for bringing it all together. It really is an amazing event. I've been asked to talk about accountability, and some of my observations will mirror those of David. In some elements, I'm going to take a different approach. And of course, like David, I'm not Armenian. I come from a different policy background, a much more military and security oriented background. Even though I never myself served in the military, I was in that orbit doing work for the better part of 20 years. I also used to teach at universities, at various universities, and one of the icebreakers that I would tell my students when I was trying to get to know them on the first session, especially when I was teaching American political history, I would ask them a question: what's your earliest political memory? And almost without exception, anything more than 10 years ago was ancient history to them. But if I asked them where they were from, my students didn't hesitate about coming and moving 1,000 kilometers away from their families and from their friends and their support networks. And that's a pretty American perspective. Anything that happened more than 10 years ago, it's so far in the past, we might as well just forget it. And it's why oftentimes Americans have such a disconnect when trying to understand that the ideology which led to the Armenian genocide and the continuation of that genocide in certain key ways, most notably which we saw on the 100th anniversary of the Ottoman invasion of independent Armenia with the surprise attack on Artsakh, that's still ongoing. It's a looming threat. It's something that most Americans don't get. And I would echo what other panelists said on previous panels: never miss an opportunity to educate people, because don't assume that they understand the same background or have this exposure that you do. Maybe it's Anne Frank in the Middle East, but it's certainly, when it comes to the Armenian genocide and its reverberations today, it's important to continue this education. Now, of course, in this part of the world, historical memory has a different context, and that's important too. It's not something that can be wished away. And with historical memory comes the issue of ideology. Now, from an American perspective in Washington, especially for people that haven't traveled extensively throughout the region, we may want to look at the problems which motivate conflict or the problems which motivate terrorism as somehow being linked to grievance rather than ideology. I tend to see, for example, when it comes to the motivations of terrorism, I envision a spectrum between grievance and ideology. But for many diplomats, it's comforting to think that this is all about a grievance. Because if it's about a grievance through bribery, which is a nice way of saying diplomatic deals, maybe these grievances can go away, but that's not realistic. What's motivating the anti-Armenian attacks and ethnic cleansing isn't grievance, it's ideology. And that's what makes it so dangerous. And that's what makes it even more dangerous if we confuse our strategies and think that we can resolve the problem simply through some creative diplomatic strategy that doesn't take in the key issues. One other issue during my 25 years or so in Washington, most of my time spent in analysis, that has really come into play is the danger of moral equivalence. When you're sitting thousands of kilometers away from the conflict, it may sound fair, it may sound judicious, it may sound even-handed if you do, on one hand, we condemn this side, and on the other hand, we condemn that side. Can't we all just get along? The reason why that sort of moral equivalence is so dangerous, whether it involves Nagorno-Karabakh and the conflict between Armenia on one hand and Turkey and Azerbaijan on the other, whether it concerns the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, whether it concerns any numbers of other conflicts around the world, is moral. If you engage in moral equivalence, what you actually do is promote more violence. You give an incentive for various sides to actually stake out more extreme positions. Because if diplomats look at the solution as always somehow being down the middle, then tactically, it makes sense to be as extreme as possible so you can shift what that middle is. it doesn't resolve conflicts, the both-siderisms, the moral equivalence. It actually makes conflicts worse. What we need instead is simply moral clarity. I would argue that U.S. credibility, and again, I don't come to this as an Armenia specialist. I come to this as a U.S. national security analyst. And so forgive me if I look at the United States for a second, but I would say that our policy credibility depends on moral clarity. When we act in a transactional fashion, when finally we recognize the Armenian genocide, but then 2 days later, illegally, according to the letter of the law, waive the provisions of Section 907 of the Freedom Support Act, we're not showing that we understand moral clarity. We're not showing that we understand the nature of of true justice. What we're showing is that we're looking at the Armenian genocide and its recognition as a cynical ploy rather than something to internalize and guide our policy to. Now, accountability also means applying Section 907. But for me, again, it's not only a matter of justice with regard to the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, the war in Artsakh. To me, not if the executive branch of the United States government doesn't apply Section 907, when the letter of the law in Section 907 clearly says that we have to certify that the party, that Azerbaijan has given up on military solutions to the problem, then what we're doing is making an affront into the entire body of U.S. law and to the U.S. Congress. To me, that is just as important as to why Congress should act. And for people that may not be as well ingrained into the history and the importance and the ongoing ideology of the genocide, it's important to also make other arguments saying this is an affront to U.S. Congress. This is the executive branch breaking the law in a way that should not stand. Now, David happily preempted me on this, but we've heard a lot about documenting human rights. And the work I've seen from Columbia University, the work I saw when I went to Artsakh a year and a half ago, just after the war, it was impressive. But documenting human rights is only one part of the battle. David mentioned about how some of the Turkish drones had American microchips, computer chips inside. And that is something which is arguably illegal, that violates export controls. And if we document that, then instead of simply pursuing the justice through the human rights angle, you have a multi-pronged approach, which you might find you have many more additional allies. For example, my Somali friends don't understand why in the middle of the night, for so-called agricultural reasons, Turkey imported drones that could arguably be used against Somali democratic opposition figures. Tigrayans don't understand why there's no consequence for the use of drones against aid organizations, civilian populations, and other targets which shouldn't be military. In this, Armenia doesn't need to be alone. It has allies in Tigray, it has allies in Somalia, it has allies in Cyprus and Greece and so forth. And the fact of the matter is, it can multiply its allies in the US Congress beyond those who are motivated simply by justice for genocide and into those who see the dangerous implications of allowing Turkey literally to get away with murder with US computer parts that are incorporated into their drones illegally. Now, one other caution that I worry about when it comes to America and Europe and perhaps other countries' approach to the conflict. We should never confuse quiet with peace. It is US quiet today, sweeping what happened under the rug, merely affirms the utility of Erdogan and Aliyev's strategies. It shows again that they can get away with what they've done, get away with murder, and not suffer any real consequence. There is another element to this in terms of, there's another element to this quiet in terms of just how dangerous it can be. Because if they are allowed to get away with this, there's something very, very dangerous with any dictators, any leaders that hold at their heart a genocidal ideology, that want to distract their public from very real economic failings, and at the same time have fabulous oil wealth at their disposal, either real, as in the case of Azerbaijan, or in the process of being stolen, as in the case of Turkey, when it comes to some of its encroachments on exclusive economic zones in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, if I can just shift gears a little bit, fear should never be an excuse. One thing, I have a pretty thick skin, and I don't engage in Twitter because basically it can be a time suck. I'll publish on Twitter, but what I will use Twitter for, full disclosure, is as a metric. When I get attacked by trolls, I know that I've struck a nerve. And so when I note that for all the talk in Baku, that Nagorno-Karabakh is their heartland, if anyone even raises a suggestion as to why Azeris aren't moving back, why they have to get their pensions withdrawn as a pressure to get them moved back, that suggests, and when I see the troll reaction to that, that suggests that there's a very real nerve there, that they are afraid that people are going to say that the emperor has no clothes when it comes to Baku. There's also an obvious fear of reparations when it comes to the Armenian genocide, and that's an elephant in a room, but that's not a reason to address the issue of historical truth. That's, granted, a policy debate for another day, but we can't simply bury certain issues because Turkey's afraid of where full disclosure and illumination of those issues might lead. The fear also means that there's got to stop being distractions. We have some friends who are coming from Iraq here, and I've spent about more than 20 years going back and forth to Iraq, and especially Iraqi Kurdistan. And I remember sitting in Washington, D.C. in 1999, and I was talking to the fairly young representative, I should say, of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, which is one of the Kurdish political parties, who was based in Washington at the time. His name was Barham Saleh. And today, of course, he's president of Iraq. And this is, if you think that Armenian politics can be rough and tumble, and one thing I'll never write about is Armenian politics, the Kurds make that look like Mother Teresa at times. I mean, between 1994 and 1997, there was an active civil war between the two major Kurdish political parties. I used to teach at both Suleymaniye University in Suleymaniye, Salahuddin University in Erbil, and I would get dragged out of the taxi by mukhabarat, by security, when I would try to cross the no man's land between them. It was so tense. But even though both the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan and the Kurdistan Democratic Party had representatives in Washington, D.C., and they were quite literally shooting at each other back in Iraqi Kurdistan, they had a rule in Washington. To the American audience, we only talk about Kurdish national interests. We don't talk about domestic politics because every mention of domestic airing of dirty laundry to a foreign audience is an opportunity wasted to show the real national security interests of Armenia today and how Armenia fits in the world. Now, some people will criticize Armenia because for whatever reasons, it has alliances with people that, with countries, for example, that the United States doesn't like. But why not make lemons out of lemonade? Armenia's greatest strength, one of its greatest strengths, I should say, one of its greatest opportunities is its diaspora. It's got a strong diaspora in the United States, thankfully, in Russia, in the United Kingdom, and in Iran. When I used to live in Iran, when they used to call me in Persian, Pasari Shaitani Bozorg, son of the great Satan, I used to live in the Armenian section of Isfahan called Jolfa. That was my first introduction. At any rate, if you have such strength in all these potential rivals, why not make yourself, from lemons to lemonade, make yourself the diplomatic mecca, the people that can talk to anyone and mediate anything? It really is a strength waiting to emerge that would silence all those who are simply looking for excuses as to why we shouldn't deal with Armenia more. Never mind that it's the blockade that oftentimes leads to that situation in the first place. Now, with that, let me just again reiterate my thanks, reiterate the education which I've received here from some of you in this room. Note that I have a very thick skin, and as a non-Armenian, I can guarantee you, I'm a historian, so I get paid to predict the past. My critics say I only get that right about 50% of the time, but I can guarantee you when it comes to crystal ball reading in the future that I'm going to get it wrong again. And don't hesitate to tell me when I get it wrong. You can demonize anyone who gets it wrong, and that's all well and good, and it feels good in the moment. But if you educate them, I tend to assume, as the late U.S. Supreme Court Justice Anthony Scalia said, I attack ideas, I don't attack people, because some very good people have very bad ideas, and rather than throw fireballs at them, sit down with them, buy them a coffee, tell them why they're wrong, and 9 times out of 10, they're going to listen. And with that, I look forward to listening at the rest of this conference. Thank you very much. Okay.
You want to sit there? Okay. Wow. Can we clone you? I've got a lot of questions. I don't know how much time we have, but I guess I want to start out with, what did you do at the Pentagon when you worked there? I'm just curious.
I was the a desk officer for Iran and Iraq in the Office of Secretary of Defense. Basically what that means is the lower you are in the Pentagon, the more you have to focus on the details. And the higher you are, the more you get to have a comparative vision. My job was between 2002 and 2004 to anticipate, to basically know who the various Iranians and Iraqis were, to anticipate if they requested a meeting, what they might say, to help decide who they would meet with, and then to give that person the training so that they could sit there and engage with this person. Of course, everyone would ask to meet with the Secretary of Defense, and sometimes I would condemn them to meet with me instead. Sometimes it would be with the undersecretary. It would depend on what the issue was, just to make sure everyone was aware.
So I want to still stay initially at the high level, because there's a lot of questions about the region and all the issues you brought up. You have a unique perspective. I mean, I worked in Washington a lot of my life, and I tend to think of the think tanks as being groupthink. They don't leave Washington very much. And your perspective of the world is very different than what we've seen of generations of policymakers at the State Department, the Pentagon, the NSC, and even in Congress. How did you come to this kind of worldview that I think is, it's not oppositional, it's unique?
Thank you very much. That's very generous. I've got to admit, one of the reasons I chose to leave the Pentagon was because I'm just a bad bureaucrat. Quite simply, I was spending 90% of my time doing paperwork or preparing for meetings that I myself wouldn't attend, and only 10% of doing what I did in substance. The same reason I got out of the Pentagon is the same reason I got out of academe. I wrote 600 pages about the introduction of the telegraph in Qajar, Iran. I know no one's ever gotten past page 17 because there's a $50 bill in the library copy, and every time I go back for a reunion, that $50 bill is still there on page 17. But I didn't want to be known as the 19th century telegraph guy. And so every few years, I'll never be as deep as I am on something like Iran, but I try to delve deep just, again, for intellectual gratification. And sometimes it was when I was teaching on the ships, the person who used to come with us, who was a former Peace Corps volunteer, who had spent decades in Horn of Africa, she retired. And so I was suddenly getting questions I couldn't answer. So I went in to try to answer those questions. In many ways, I also that led to my first trip to Armenia as well, because I always had a perspective. Part of that perspective was wrong. People took the time to actually sit down with me and chat through some of the issues at great length and with great patience. And then that ultimately led to a visit to Artsakh, where I was able to talk to people directly rather than have to get filtered information. One thing, which is true of the US government and also, frankly, in Europe, is many people rotate in and out of a job after 2 years, and then they move on to the next portfolio. So what they receive is received wisdom, and they never actually question whether that's accurate or not. And so sometimes being able to get outside the security bubble.
Are they allowed to question it?
They are allowed to question it. It takes a lot of effort to try to track things down, and usually you have enough bureaucratic resistance that someone will just sort of slow roll you until your time in office is up. And there's a lot of very good diplomats out there. The problem is we have something in US embassies called regional security officers, and their job is to keep people safe. The easiest way to keep a diplomat safe is to not let them go outside. And ultimately, then we become victims of our own diplomatic gilded prison. So, in some think tank work, and I'm fortunate enough to be given independence, I'm able to get outside the bubble, have some insight into what government's interested in without actually being in government myself.
Wow. So I'm not texting, I'm getting questions. There's lots of questions coming in. I wanted to ask this of David, but I will ask you because he brought it up and you touched on it as well. And I actually had it as a question before I knew what you were going to say. And it has to do with, are we, when I say we, I guess the United States, we're at AUA, are we on an irreversible course of transactional foreign policy? And maybe for some, explain what what that means.
Transactional foreign policy means, of course, that we give something, we want something, we give something. It's a win, in theory, a win-win compromise, but you always have to assuage both sides. To me, that actually downplays and diminishes the potential influence of the United States, because we shouldn't necessarily, and this is going to sound arrogant, lower ourselves to the level of some other country and bargain as equals when, in terms of power, we're not. What I would say is the US has a problem with, by default, engaging in transactional diplomacy. But what I hear from complaints outside of Armenia is it's a broader problem that many other countries suffer from. So, for example, when we want to strike an agreement with regard to Turkish weapons in the hands of Belarus, somehow why does Cyprus have to be the person that gives the concession on that when it comes to winning Germany's approval for sanctions? It's that convoluted. But the other problems, beside this nature of transaction and having small countries pay the price for compromises which they have nothing to do with. Too often the United States and Europe too can be myopic. And it's amazing how we can spend billions on diplomacy, even more on the military, and yet we can only focus on one thing at the same time, which gives an advantage, as we see now with Turkey. All eyes are on Ukraine, so let's ramp up pressure elsewhere. All eyes were, I don't think it was a coincidence that the surprise attack on Artsakh also came when the United States was navel gazing in terms of our own electoral campaign,
Right.
and people were too paralyzed. That's got to stop as well.
So when I remember in the 90s, when I would have meetings with the House Foreign Affairs folks, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and we talk about the bad act, that Turkey is truly a bad actor and not a reliable ally. They literally would pull out a map and say, look at a map. and with the notion that because of their location, there's really almost nothing they can do that would jeopardize our relationship with them. And I never really I understand that in terms of realpolitik, but I don't understand it in terms of our values and, our long-term partnerships. Is that I'm sure you've seen that view.
Yeah. Not only do I see that view, I used to partake of that view, as many of you know. First of all, things have changed. Turkey has changed. Armenia has changed. Turkey has reversed. It was always, if you want to say that it was at all democratic, it was always imperfect. It's gone backwards, as David has shown with some of the data. Armenia, on the other hand, has moved forwards by leaps and bounds. The issue, there's a couple other issues there. Turkey was one of the 2 NATO states that bordered the former Soviet Union, but of course the Soviet Union is gone. At the same time, Turkey was most of my contacts in Turkey were from Turgut Özal's era. And as they would often point out, hey, look, Turkey is a major NATO ally. And look back at what we, the Turks, did in the Korean War and elsewhere with the Cuban Missile Crisis as well. Well, that's all well and good, but it's no longer the 1950s or 1960s. And at the same time, if Erdogan, there's something deeply, deeply cynical where Erdogan or his fellow travelers will try to take advantage of Turkey's NATO legacy, while at the same time, Turkey is actively arresting military officers who have spent too much time operating within NATO because they're no longer trusted because he wants to go a different direction. At the same time, with the expansion of NATO, I'm not talking Sweden and Finland here, let's talk Romania. And the fact of the matter is, we no longer rely on the Incirlik Air Base the way we once did because we've built up a facility inside Romania. We also have something called, the ships are called LHDs, landing helodecks, but you can think of them as amphibious assault vessels or small aircraft carriers. And if you have those in the Eastern Mediterranean that fly Harrier jump jets or F-35s or the Ospreys, which are the helicopters that become planes, why do we need Incirlik so much? So a lot has changed on the ground and we need to keep up with the time, therefore. Yeah. No, Turkey's not a legacy ally. Turkey has agency. We haven't betrayed them. It's Erdogan's decision. And if I may, there's a lot of wishful thinking in Washington that Turkey is going to change as soon as Erdogan is off the stage. Count me as one who doesn't think that Erdogan is going to accept any sort of electoral defeat. More likely, there's going to be a crisis which will perpetually delay elections. But if Erdogan someday does go, every Democrat wakes up in the morning knowing when his term in office ends. Every dictator wakes up in the morning knowing that today could be his very last. When Turkey changes, keep in mind that more than, I think, 25 million Turkish school children have gotten their education under Erdogan. If you started your military career as a private on the first day Erdogan took office, you're likely either be a lieutenant colonel or a colonel today, which means pretty much the whole military, because he's also changed the general staff, has been shaped in Erdogan's image. To believe that the Turkish military is going to go back to the status quo ante is, I think, woefully naive and discounts the fact that, demography has changed in the last 20 some odd years as well.
Oh, so I'm told I'm given the hook, but I have to ask 2 more questions. I told you I had a lot to say and to ask, not say. I can't leave this without asking about Artsakh. So we all know what happened during the war. It is my belief that the actions of Azerbaijan have disqualified it from ever ruling over Artsakh, and that the only viable pathway forward is for the people there to exercise their legal right of self-determination. How, in your view, can we get there?
Two things. One issue, I'm going to put human rights aside for now and just say I agree with you in the conclusion underlying that question. I would say that Armenians need to make a much better case, and those in Artsakh need to make a much better case for non-Armenian audiences with regard to the legal foundations of their arguments about why Artsakh is Armenian. So, for example, someone who wasn't familiar with this history, one thing which I hadn't been aware of is when Azerbaijan reclaimed its independence, they reclaimed it in a manner in which they recognized the territory. They based their re-independence on the territory of their initial independence, which didn't take into account, which preceded Stalin's gerrymandering, which ultimately led to the current Azerbaijani claims to Nagorno-Karabakh. So you have a situation in which, by Azerbaijan's own independence, its claims over Nagorno-Karabakh are false and at best they're questionable, and for Azerbaijan, at worst, they're false. I mean, they undermine their own pillar. At the same time, it's been explained to me some of the issues relating to, and I've seen some people here who have direct personal knowledge of this time period, of if you want to go back, if you want to ignore the pre-Soviet gerrymandering and you just want to look at the constitutional right of the people in Nagorno-Karabakh to have their own referendum, well, why not? I mean, that case needs to be made much more clearly to Western audience. Multiple arguments, all leading to the same issue. And then, of course, as you've had referendums before, it's always possible to have a referendum again, even if it's not internationally recognized, as has occurred in Iraqi Kurdistan with more success in 2005 than 2017. You've got a situation where it can at least build momentum and drive conversation.
So, final question. So, as you know, that there are discussions now taking place on a rapprochement between Armenia and Turkey, and there are discussions happening now between Armenia and Azerbaijan, or some kind of peace agreement. As you know, with respect to Turkey, Armenia has never attacked Turkey. Turkey imposed an act of war, a blockade on Armenia in 1992. And we know in Artsakh that the Armenians were defending themselves against egregious human rights abuses and military aggression. We have two states that are autocratic, that are extremely, their leadership are extremely wealthy. They're extraordinarily corrupt. They seem to be immune to outside pressures, but you alluded to it to a certain degree with Section 907. What actions can have an effect on the behaviors of autocratic regimes like Turkey and Azerbaijan? Is it just legislation? Is it the threat of military intervention? Is it both?
This analogy will make more sense for the Americans in the audience than perhaps people who have spent their lives in Armenia. But if you've ever seen the comic strip Charlie Brown, too often we can be like Charlie Brown kicking the football, not realizing that Lucy is going to pick it up and he's going to fall on his back every single time. I guess another way to put it was, it's been attributed to Albert Einstein that the definition of insanity is making the same mistake repeatedly, but doing the same thing repeatedly, but expecting different results each time. When it comes to the way I would apply it to your question is, we need to understand what motivates both Azerbaijan and Turkey in terms of any discussion of peace or reconciliation. I mean, whether it's in terms of Korea, the Islamic Republic of Iran, various other countries around the world, the canary in the coal mine for me has always been religious freedom. If a country is truly reforming, it's going to allow people free practice of religion. We don't see that in Turkey. Increasingly, we see a very cynical approach to it in Azerbaijan. Rather, it seems that feigning reconciliation has much more to do with the decline of the currency and popular unease. One thing, when I look at, for example, World Bank statistics, and I look at per capita income, the fact that per capita income in Armenia is higher than per capita income in Georgia or Azerbaijan. And when we look at Azerbaijan, the fact that you have tremendous oil and gas wealth in Azerbaijan, which means for the per capita income to be lower than Armenia, is just a testament to how many billions of dollars the Aliyahs have stolen. It's no surprise that when I've given lectures inside, like at Khazar University in Baku, when I'm being driven back to my hotel, I'm having people who were just a second ago singing Aliyah's praises tell me when we're in a private car out of a public space that might be tapped, just how horrible things are. And so we shouldn't be fooled by this. We shouldn't be fooled, of course, by the caviar diplomacy. We should shine a light on that and expose that. But ultimately, I would argue again, in both cases, the emperor has no clothes. Rather than look at Recep Tayyip Erdogan as if we're playing poker and allow him to win a hand when we have a full, when we have a royal flush and he's out bluffing us with a pair of twos. What we need to recognize is when he took Pastor Andrew Brunson hostage, the former administration, after trying diplomatic entreaties quietly to get the pastor released, put on even some relatively minor tariffs on steel, and it crashed the Turkish currency. I know for a fact, even though it's not as public, that when this past November, we had a situation where mostly Iraqi Kurdish refugees were on the Belarus-Polish border, freezing to death or drowning in the English Channel. And they were being flown to Belarus from Turkey by Turkish Airlines. What finally caused Erdogan rather suddenly to reverse his policy was when the European Union very quietly threatened to sanction Turkish Airlines. When Turkey has set aside extra space in its airlines to profit off the war in Ukraine by bringing people to Turkish beaches, and yet Greece has not taken any Russian tourists, and their beaches are just as nice. I would actually argue there needs to be much more solidarity, and that goes beyond the Armenian issue, to recognize that Turkey isn't simply victimizing one country. It's a revanchist state, not able to live within its own borders, and it's using the nationalist flag and creating crises in order to distract its own people. If I could just finish with one joke. I mean, there's a Turkish joke about one of these Turkish political prisoners goes into the prison library and asks whether he could have a series of books from the prison library. And the prison librarian apologizes profusely and says, "I'm so sorry, we don't have these books. We only have their authors." The fact of the matter is, Turkey has changed so fundamentally. We need to recognize that. It's a threat to everyone. But then again, I would also argue that one of the greatest victims of Turkey today are the Turks themselves. Yeah. And the future for Armenia and Armenia-Turkish rapprochement, which I think is possible, if we look at people like Osman Kavala, who's in prison, is actually recognizing that they have suffered, some of them have suffered, and that in the future, that they can be a driving force because they want normality. They've discovered they want normality, and many of them are discovering the truth of history and are willing to make amends.
Well, with that, thank you, Michael. Let's give Michael a big round of applause.
I guess I'll do this. You can present it. Do you want to know what to say?
No, I got it. Well, I mean, do I need to say? So I'm very proud and honored to present to Dr. Michael Rubin the Ambassador of Truth Award on behalf of the Center for Truth and Justice. I think what you saw today was exemplified and personified who Dr. Rubin has been over many years, and even in the course in the most recent years, why you're getting this particular award. You speak truth, you're honest, you're not afraid to take on conventional wisdom, and you provide inspiration, not to just to Armenians, but to around the world to effectuate a justice that means something beyond, as we talked about, transactions. So thank you very much. Well deserved.
Thank you so much.